Choose your professor! Professor Cynic!
Hello, students! Professor Cynic here. Thank you for selecting me. See, I was getting a little stir-crazy in character menu purgatory. I'm running a simulation to see what makes a character more prone to being selected. But here I am, back in the laboratory, health and stamina fully charged, ready for you to take in my wonderful story. It'll be filled with action, tragedy, and perhaps even a bit of romance, huh? You didn't read my character bio? It was in the pamphlet provided at the beginning of the simulation. Alright, well later I could take some qualitative notes down from you, but in the meantime I'm going to assume you selected me based solely on my rugged handsomeness. Speaking of character choice though, that reminds me of a game I recently played, Octopath Traveler. See, it's a new JRPG for the Nintendo Switch. The beginning of the game offers you a wide selection of characters to begin your journey. And that first selection is always really difficult. But you chose me, so I hope you choose to stay here for my review of Octopath Traveler. So controllers down, pencils up, classes in session. If you'd like to avoid some minor narrative spoilers, I'd recommend traveling to this point in the video. Quick disclaimer, I usually like to complete games before I review them. But with Octopath Traveler, I knew I wouldn't get this review out in time if I played through all of the main storylines. I did put in 30 hours before completing this review, but I wanted you to know that for reference. Now, onto the narrative. Okay, this is going to be a disaster, but let's give it a try, shall we? In case your perception skills are lacking, here's the skinny on Octopath's narrative. The Octo is deliberate because there's 8 characters that you can choose from to begin your journey. I'm not going to discuss each one in depth, so here's a quick rundown of each. She's a religious Hermione Granger on a pilgrimage. He's a know-it-all who's dodging sexual allegations. She wants to be the bestest at selling things. He's a warrior who doesn't know why he's a warrior anymore. She's a stripper out on a tour of revenge. He's a... wait a second. Wait, she's a stripper who's out for blood? Alright, have to admit that sounds pretty intriguing. Anyway, he's a healer who wants to heal because healing's good. He's a thief who wants to get a piece of jewelry off of himself, and she's a pokey trainer looking for her mentor. That's the straight and narrow of it. When you start your journey, you pick one of these fine individuals and eventually add the others, so really they are all playable at some point. I don't know if I can include the selection process for my first character as part of my overall playtime, but I damn well think I should. I suffered a nasty case of analysis paralysis when selecting my first character because there's just so many options. I found that choosing between 8 characters was a bit much, but no one can say that Octopath doesn't have something for nearly everyone here. When selecting your first character, not much is offered up other than basic background information. The character I landed on was Elfin, who's an apothecary. I'll go into his backstory a little bit just to give you an idea of what a character's narrative may look like in Octo. Once, as a child, Elfin fell deathly ill with what I can only assume is medieval AIDS because we aren't given any additional info. A nameless apothecary strolls through town at just the right time and cures Elfin of his affliction. The apothecary informs Elfin that he doesn't expect anything in return, because he's not Pfizer. It's simply the right thing to do. This leaves quite the impression on the little lad, and he decides that he wants to travel the world healing people, just for the good of it. And so Elfin does just that. He ventures out to start healing people, I guess. Now, I've had the chance to get at least some cursory playtime in for each character. Out of all the characters, Elfin's springboard into his narrative is noticeably less springy than the other characters because he really doesn't have a tangible purpose to set out on his journey. It's nothing we can put a finger on, it's more of an ideal. Whereas most of the other characters have a definitive thing they're trying to accomplish. Elfin is just trying to be a good dude. In and of itself, doing good for good's sake isn't a bad narrative route to plow. In fact, it was a bit refreshing to have a character who wants to be good, a stark contrast to the college dorm lavatory state our real world seems to be in at this moment. But even an altruistic story needs to have a sharper point if it wants to hold the audience in a video game, and unfortunately, my first character's narrative failed to do this. But while Elfin's story didn't fill me with passion, no matter, because there's 7 other potential stories to partake in. There's bound to be a good one in there, right? Right? Oh Jesus, please don't tell me there's 8 completely lackluster stories. Well, I do have some good news. Not all of the stories are as bland as a communion wafer, though it's definitely a mixed bag. As you heard me stammer over earlier, the story of Primrose is quite interesting. Her father was killed when she was a child, and she has since made her purpose in life to find the men who did the deed and exact revenge upon them. She's an exotic dancer, and her personality is brimming with fiery charisma. Her story was definitely a standout amongst the group, and I waited with bated breath to continue the next chapter in her tale. But then we have characters like Tressa. She wants to travel the world and be a good merchant. Essentially, she's the capitalistic version of Elfin. Another story with no discernible point? Yawn. See, this is the problem when you have 8 different characters. As a writer and developer, you have to give love and care to each of them to create a narrative that's going to intrigue players. But that's gotta be hard to do with 8 characters. And Octo makes this apparent. And you've got to think, well, these characters are all coming together for a unified purpose, right? I mean, sure, maybe some of them have watered down backstories, but it'll all be made up for their unified goal. To defeat a terrible villain, to save the world, and all that jazz. No. As far as I can tell, there isn't a singular story here. Each character is carrying on their own story independent from the other characters. They only happen to be together because this is a JRPG. And that's what you do in JRPGs. You stick together. 4 of you to be exact, even if they have nothing to do with each other. And when I say the characters have nothing to do with each other, I really mean they don't have anything to do with each other. Each character has chapters that organize their tale. 4 chapters apiece, it would seem. As you complete the chapters, you'll never see your other characters in the cutscenes interacting with the main character in that moment. It's relegated to whosever chapter you're currently playing through. You'll occasionally be prompted to press the start button for additional dialogue. This tends to happen after a cutscene. The main character for that chapter will have a few lines of completely inconsequential dialogue with another character from your current team. I of course always engage in these because it's the only time I've seen my characters interact with each other. But even this feels really clunky and inorganic. You get the feeling that these encounters are forced, almost solely to keep critics like myself at bay from saying the characters lack synergy. Oh god, I can't believe I just said that. Need to find some Listerine, maybe Drano. And I know, it would take a ridiculous amount of time and resources to have the other equipped characters interact in the cutscenes because of all the potential character combinations. But then why not cut down the amount of characters to make this possible? Is 8 really necessary? I know this is in the interest of giving the player choice, but why not do 6 or 4 characters really well? That way they can each have a smashing backstory and they can interact with each other more. Let me pose a question. Would you rather choose from 8 different flavors of ramen, all prepared by your frat house roomie Kurt? Or would you want Emerald Lagasse to use his expert chef knowledge to whip up a world-class Alfredo dish? I'm sure Cyrus would prefer Alton Brown so he can explain the shit out of making a simple grilled cheese, but that's neither here nor there. But think about it. With Kurt you have choice, yes, but at what cost? None of the meals are bound to be all that satisfying or flavorful. With Emerald, you don't really get the choice, but he is a master at his craft. He's someone who knows a flavorful narrative isn't something that you can stick in a foil packet. No, it needs love, hard work, dedication. He's going to cook the fuck out of that narrative Alfredo. And you're going to be thinking about it every time you're slumming it with Kurt and his shrimp-flavored Marushan. Bam, 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 bam. Alright, metaphor went a little off the rails there, but my point is, giving players more choice ultimately dilutes narrative. Or at least it's really difficult not to dilute it. Restricting choice even a little bit more in Octo may have made for a stronger narrative experience. But enough with the main characters, how about the rest of Octo's narrative? The title takes place in the land of Astera. And I have to say, it's brimming with variety and personality. Each of the main characters comes from a different region at Narstera. You'll find that each region has its own unique feel to it. I was immensely excited whenever I was able to travel to a new region just for the chance to see how it compared to the others, even if I knew a subpar story for a new character awaited me. And something that really impressed me is that each area has its own unique style of speech and dialect, and the NPCs reflect this. It really makes you feel like you are traveling the world and experiencing different cultures. Well, to the extent that you can in the video game. Oh, but one area, the NPCs speak in a Shakespearean English dialect. Ugh, it was like nails on a chalkboard. I couldn't get out of that region fast enough. A SparkNotes version of the dialogue in this region would have been greatly appreciated. And you'll find that some of your characters are able to chat up NPCs in order to get some additional background information on them. At first I found this interesting because this meant I could get background on nearly any NPC with a speech bubble above their head. The novelty wore off after a while just because there are so many NPCs, but those who really want to dive deep into the world of should enjoy this. Ultimately, I found the narratives for most of the travelers to be unimaginative and frankly forgettable. However, some travelers carried more than their fair share of the narrative weight, so their individual stories aren't a complete loss. Emphasis there on the individual part, because there is a glaring lack of synergistic main storyline for all of the travelers to take part in. Despite these shortcomings, the world of is packed full of regional differences that at least partly makes one forget how dull some of the travelers' stories are. Octopath Traveler's narrative gets a B-. Octopath Traveler is a JRPG. You probably know how the core gameplay loop works for these, so I'm not going to do a complete dissection of that. You go in the wild, fight stuff, level up, go and fight a big boss, lose to big boss because you weren't properly leveled, go back in the wild, fight stuff, level up, go to fight the big boss again, lather, rinse, repeat. Octo is no different. You'll spend the majority of your time navigating your way through combat, but every JRPG does combat a little different, so let's dive into how Octo does its thing. Here's what a typical battle looks like. We've got our turn initiative shown at the top of the screen, with the leftmost character being active. Then we have our team stats on the right hand of the screen, and the enemies displaying their information below themselves. Combat is heavily focused on this concept of breaking your opponent. So you'd best get used to the mechanic early if you want to succeed in battle. Let me explain. Under your enemies, you'll find a shield with a number. This is the amount of points remaining before you break your opponent. If an enemy isn't broken, they will take much less damage from you. So how do we break an opponent? Well, to the right of the shield are a series of squares. When you happen upon an enemy for the first time, these will be filled with question marks. These are the enemy's weaknesses, and every type of enemy has a different series of weaknesses. There is a character that can spend skill points in battle to discover enemy weaknesses, but if you don't have him in your party, it's a complete guessing game. You'll have to throw everything you have at an enemy to discover what their weaknesses are. Once an enemy is hit with an attack that it's weak to, it will forever be displayed in their list of weaknesses for the current battle and during subsequent encounters. I think that this mechanic is a clever way to get players to try every attack that your team has at its disposal. You really can't get set in your ways with a favorite set of moves because you'll probably encounter new enemies who aren't weak to whatever attack it is you'd like to lean on. And it is oh so satisfying when you're chipping away at a new enemy, you've thrown the kitchen sink at them and you still haven't managed to find a weakness, but then you use an attack that is buried deep down in your move list and it reveals one of those squares, thereby changing the tide of battle. Oh, it's so rewarding. But I'm wandering off what I was originally getting to. Once you know an enemy's weakness, you can start the process of breaking them. Every time an enemy is hit with an attack it's weak to, it will remove 1 point from their shield. Some attacks employ multiple hits at once, so you may have the ability to take off several points with one attack. Once that total hits 0, the camera zooms in on the enemy, and a slow motion animation and shatter sound effect lets the player know that the enemy has been broken. This is your chance to pile on as much damage to that specific enemy as possible, because they are now more vulnerable, though you'll only have one turn to attack them in a broken state before they regain their shield, and they must be broken again. And despite being broken, you should still pay attention to the weaknesses, because these will now do even more damage to the enemy now that they're broken, as opposed to the moves they are not weak to. Breaking an opponent also steals away their next move. This is where the initiative display at the top comes in handy. It's a bit of a tango to strategize who to break and when. For instance, if I'm facing 3 enemies, and one of them is up next, but they're 1 point away from being broken, I might prioritize trying to break that opponent as opposed to going for the other enemies so that I rob their opportunity of a move this turn. Or perhaps you're fighting a boss, and that boss is charging up for a powerful area of effect attack. I could go after the lackeys who are actively attacking my team, but I know the boss is about to lay down a walloping in 4 moves. At that point, I would probably direct my team to try and break the boss so that we steal his turn, and thereby ruin his charge move. Suffice to say, breaking your opponents is really important, and if you don't really like the trial and error of finding your enemy's weaknesses so you can break them, I've got a bit of bad news for you. Attacking enemies that aren't broken is a lot like flicking nickels at Andre the Giant. Sure, if you hit him in the same spot maybe, I don't know, several thousand times, you might produce a blood clot that travels to his brain and snuffs him out, but the more likely scenario is that you'll mildly disturb him with your shenanigans, and he'll grab you by your feet and swing your body into hard things until you become nothing more than a meat puppet. Breaking your enemies is going to be absolutely necessary if you want to do well in combat. Can you win some battles without breaking enemies? Sure, there's always the chance that you outmaneuvered an opponent and slowly chipped away at them for the victory, or you've simply outleveled them to such a degree that breaks don't matter and one AoE attack wipes the battlefield. But I think you're going to have a rough time if you don't work with this mechanic, especially when facing bosses. But enough about breaks. Another interesting mechanic in combat is boost points. You can see on the sidebar that your team has health, skill points, which are used for a character's special attack, and boost points. Every turn, each of your characters will earn a boost point. You can earn up to a total of 5 boost points. You can spend these points to increase the strength of your team's attacks, and any amount of points from 1 to 4 can be spent at a time. The more spent at one time, the more damage done. This adds another element of strategy, as it isn't wise in most scenarios to burn your boost points right away. I found that generally, it's a good idea to save up the points, and then spend several at once on a broken opponent to maximize damage output. Another wrinkle to consider with boost points is that if boosting a character's standard weapon, instead of increasing the strength, it increases the number of hits dealt. This is important when deciding which enemies to break. For instance, let's say an enemy has 3 shield points and is weak to axes. If I have a character who wields an axe and has enough boost points, I could break that enemy with one character's turn. So really, usage of boost points comes down to increasing damage output and breaking enemies quicker. And those are the main mechanics of battle. There's the standard fare you'll see in JRPGs, items, status effects, etc. But these other mechanics really didn't stand out to the point where I feel the need to discuss them. You can infer most of what is present. Though I may have made it sound more complicated than it really is, I found combat in Octo really easy to get the basics down, but it offers enough complexity to give the player a challenge in mastering combat. It focuses heavily on the boosts and breaks, and doesn't get too frilly in other areas, which makes for a clean combat experience. It's a good thing that a majority of the game is spent in combat, because this aspect of the game is incredibly enjoyable and just downright fun. And with 8 different characters to choose from to build a team of 4, there's bound to be a combination of characters out there for any playstyle. But how about the time spent in between battles? Each character has a weapon type or types that they can equip, as well as head-to-toe armor and accessories to boost stats. I usually get overwhelmed by this process in JRPGs, but I found that outfitting your team in Octo to be a smooth process. The menus were really easy to navigate, and I didn't have to spend much time figuring out what I was going to do because it was so straightforward. Some people really like to stay buried in those equipment menus, tweaking every little bit of their kit to build the perfect team. Not I, says the professor. I'd rather go back to breaking some fools' asses on the battlefield. But speaking of the equipment, a glaring weakness in Octo is loot. As you traverse the world of you'll find that treasure chests are generally scattered about the terrain, but I realized quickly that the chests mostly contain shit that you can easily get other places. It feels like 9 times out of 10, it's just a simple item that restores a bit of health or skill points. I was really hoping these would contain more equipment for my team, but alas, they contain basic items for basic bitches. It's gotten to the point that if a chest is a little bit out of my set path, I won't even bother because I probably already have 35 of what's in there. There are some red chests that are special and contain better items, but you need a thief in your group to unlock it. I don't like the thief character and I can't be to swap him out to get the chest, so I've largely been passing these up. And sometimes, bosses will drop decent pieces of equipment. I'm hoping that as I progress further in the game, this becomes more frequent. The looting in Octo is really disappointing overall. There are a slew of side quests available in every town you visit. While it adds quite a bit of additional content to the game, I found most of the side stories to be very meh. Most of the quests seem to involve using your character's skills to complete. I need to make this thing, so you go around and steal shit so the person can make the thing. I haven't encountered a single side story that I really felt the need to complete right then and there because it seemed interesting. Their overall execution comes off as lazy and tedious. As for the main story, each character has their own little tale, separated into different chapters. The map leads you to where you need to go to continue a particular character's story. Playing through the main stories is far more satisfying than the side stories. It typically follows a loop of go into the village, experience some cutscenes to advance the story, do some other things, fight a boss, then conclude this part of the story. You already know how much I enjoy the combat, and it's heightened even further during boss battles. Several times now I've spent around 45 minutes in a single boss battle. It was a tactician's wet dream, and I was on the edge of my seat the entire time. Overall, Octopath Traveler's gameplay is held up by a masterfully executed combat system. It's the time in between battles that has a noticeable lack of polish. Whether it's boring looting or boring side stories, I'm always itching to get back into a good fight. Octopath Traveler's gameplay gets a B+. Octo's visual style is, drumroll please, pixel art. I know I've mentioned it in numerous reviews, but that 16-bit pixely style really is the in thing right now, and it's starting to become a bit of a drag. I completely understand that it can be more practical for indie developers to go for this aesthetic, but Square certainly doesn't fall into that category, so the choice was definitely deliberate, likely to scratch that nostalgia itch. But because of the plethora of games coming out with this visual style, it takes a lot to stand out. I think that Octo hit the mark for their visuals. The character models are admittedly very simple, but what impressed me the most was the landscape of the design of 3D landscape so perfectly contrasts with the characters. It almost appears as though the characters are running around in a pop-up book, and perhaps this was their intention. I mean, the Wayfarers edition of the game comes with an actual pop-up book. The drawn images of the travelers are absolutely gorgeous. I was disappointed to find out that you really won't see this style beyond the opening character selection screen. I think it would have been great if they employed this style during cutscenes, maybe as an occasional still to illustrate the situation. This was most assuredly a missed opportunity. As for audio, Octo's tracklist didn't leave a lasting impression on me. I will say that it blended well enough with the other elements to give it a cinematic feel through most of the game. Each area has its own distinct musical feel. There weren't any flashy tracks that burrowed into my brain, but Octo does enough in the musical department to be competent. I did enjoy the voice acting for the most part. It's similar to the narrative situation, where some of the travelers stand out in a good way and others are meh. Some of them felt downright awkward, like Ulberich. He's the warrior guy, so it stands to reason that he's supposed to have a masculine, macho voice. But the delivery feels pointedly out of place and clunky. And then there's Hannett, who has the ye old English thing going on, which I've already voiced my displeasure with. Something that I find really confusing about the voice acting is that during some important cutscenes, the travelers and the people they are interacting with have fully recorded lines of dialogue. Then shortly after this, the cutscene may continue, but now you're only getting openers to the lines of dialogue. I'm sure you've experienced this before. A character says something that is kind of related to the dialogue you're reading on the screen. An example might be a character has a eureka moment and several lines of dialogue show on the screen, but the only voice line you hear is, "But of course." You know, something like this. You get the point.
Damn it all! What foul beast did this to my Nina?
Let me ask around. Maybe someone saw something.
A few moments later.
Nina.
I felt like the transition between full dialogue and fragmented dialogue, for lack of better phrasing, feels abrupt at times during cutscenes. I understand that it's not possible to have fully recorded dialogue throughout the entirety of the game, especially one that is this expansive and contains a boatload of NPCs you can interact with. And the gameplay does employ that fragmented dialogue with those encounters outside of the cutscenes, but I can get down with that. I just don't understand the decision to do the cutscenes with half of it being full voice lines and half fragmented voice lines. It makes for a jarring listening experience. Octopath Traveler gets a visual grade of B+, and an audio grade of B. Octopath Traveler runs the standard AAA price of $59.99. As I mentioned earlier, I've played for about 30 hours. I still have a lot of content remaining for the main stories, and I'm playing at a pretty leisurely pace, so I still have plenty of traveling to look forward to. And while I've enjoyed progressing through the main stories and spending time in combat, it's the other stuff, I'll call it, in Octo that left me disappointed. The side stories aren't really engaging, there isn't much fun in going around looting, and that's really all you have aside from the combat and main story. The side stories add a sizable amount of content for those who want to be completionists, so if you find that you like them, Octopath Traveler is a smashing value, even at the premium price. As for me, I'm probably going to drop the game once I have all of the main stories completed because I'm just not that interested in what remains afterwards. Octopath Traveler's value gets a B+. And students, there you have it, my review of Octopath Traveler. If you're into JRPGs and you're looking for a game to keep you busy for a while, I think that this one's worth taking a look at. It doesn't hurt that you can bring it on the go too. So plugging Octopath Traveler's component grades into my rubric leaves it with a final grade of B+. And students, I remind you to always stay cynical. Alright, I think that went well. We'll start the simulation from the top. I think we'll only need to do it about another maybe 300 times or so. That should give us some good figures for analysis. Make sure you read the pamphlet this time. And then, what are you doing? No, don't go over there. That is not, don't touch the menu. That is not part of the simulation. Don't touch the menu. Don't go into it. No.
Thank you for your patience while awaiting selection. Thank you for your patience while awaiting selection.